Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another live with me. Again, it's another rainy Sunday, so you know we're stuck inside, so might as well make the best of it. Let me ask you: have you ever had a discussion or a debate where you're trying to convince the other person you think you're absolutely right, while the other person also thinks that they're absolutely right? You're both trying to convince each other of your arguments, of your reasoning as to why you believe your idea, your thought is correct. Why can't that other person see that where you're coming from is the right way? I think we've all been there in this type of situation. How about in terms of, working with a group of people or a team? Have you asked someone to do something, but they failed your expectations? How about in a meeting? Everybody's been assigned a task or an action item, and you thought it was clear to everyone what needed to be done. But later on, you find out or discover that what they end up doing is totally off base. In these cases, we think, again, this person is being negligent or not paying attention or incapable. You're blaming them. It was their fault. It's their fault for not understanding what you're saying. It's their fault for not doing what you asked them to do. Again, I'm sure we've been in this situation. I think it's just a lot of misunderstandings between people, and I believe the source of this misunderstanding is both communication and a cognitive bias. So, what's a cognitive bias? So, I'll talk about that first. Okay, so on Wikipedia, the definition there is a cognitive bias is a systemic pattern of deviation from a norm or rationality in judgment. Individuals create their own subjective reality from their perception of the input. An individual's construction of reality, not the objective input, may dictate their behavior in the world. Thus, cognitive biases may sometimes lead to perceptual distortion, inaccurate judgment, illogical interpretation, or what is broadly called irrationality. So, from my own definition, translating into what I think people would understand is a cognitive bias is basically a specific way of thinking or a perspective that governs how you think and how you act. So, what are some examples of biases? So, I'll go over three that probably some people may uh, recognize. So, the first one is a confirmation bias, which is probably the most common one that I've encountered, and I know that I'm guilty of it as well. This is where a person favors facts and ideas that confirm their own beliefs. Right? You're only looking for things that support your argument. So, for example, if I'm debating with someone that I think Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player ever, I would only seek out and present information that supports this and ignore anything else that would say otherwise. Right? Even though there might be information that contradicts or proves that I'm wrong, I'm going to ignore it. I'm only going to look for the things that support what I believe in. Another type of bias is declinism. This is where a person is predisposed to view the past favorably and the future negatively. So, again, we've probably all seen this. Usually, someone that's older talking about how great something was back in their day, back in the past, and how things have changed and how things will turn bad, down the road or into the future. Example is, you know, using health as a health. People used to do more physical activity, back in the day. Today and in the future, all they do is sit at home, sitting in front of an electronic device. Right. So again, declinism is I feel that I view the past in a positive light, whereas I view the future from a negative perspective. And lastly, another type of cognitive bias is pessimism bias. This is where people tend to think bad things always happen to them, right? That's like the person who's always in a could be possibly depressed actually, that they think things are never going to go their way. So, for example, if whenever I go outside for a walk, it always rains and ruins my plans. It always happens to me, right? Always being pessimistic. So those are like three types of cognitive bias that you may be familiar with. There was the confirmation bias, declinism, and the pessimism bias, right? You see how they, again, dictate and govern how we think and how we act. So this bias, it puts a filter in front of us, right? So if you imagine the analogy of lenses on glasses, right? Where these biases are these types of glasses that we put on in front of us, and oh, hey David, yep, Murphy's Law, yeah, totally agree with that. What I was saying was that these biases, they put this filter in front of us, and we see them through these lenses, and it potentially clouds what we see and how we see it. And it's not necessarily the right thing to do, but know that it prevents you from maybe keeping an open mind about things or seeing things from a larger perspective. Cognitive biases, they make us believe that whatever we do and think is right. It's like we have these glasses on, these filters, and because no one else has them, they don't see things our way. And if they never see things our way, we'll never be aligned. So we'll never come to an agreement, or we'll always have an argument. So we always think that people act and behave a certain way, but we have our own reasons for that. And this is where the cognitive bias clouds our thinking, and gives everyone an easy way to explain everything. I feel that as human beings, we like things wrapped in a neat little package. If there's an easy logical explanation for something, we'll accept it, right? We don't like to work our brains, right? It's easier to have something just neatly presented to us rather than doing a bit of critical thinking, a little bit of exploring, right? Thinking critically like takes effort, and it's hard, right? Knowing that most, if not all of us, have some sort of cognitive bias should make us realize that we're all different. Again, we're human beings. We're all different. We're all unique, which means we think differently, we act differently, we do everything differently. It's probably the odds are, I'm sure there is someone that may be almost identical to how we think and act, but it's probably pretty low. Like I've never met someone that's exactly identical to myself. So know that when you're dealing with another person, if they're not on the same wavelength, how can you ever be aligned? So it's your job to communicate, ensure that whenever you're communicating, your thoughts and your ideas are clear, right? And understandable by that other person or that other party, right? And this is where the communication comes in, right? Good communication, clear communication, right? All of us, we need to, in some form or manner, communicate our thoughts and ideas to another person. And what one person says isn't necessarily interpreted or mean the same thing to the other person. I'll try to think of an example. For example, if I ask you, could you please go buy me a car, okay? And then you come back and you brought back like a Toyota Camry. I'm like, that's not what I asked for. But the other person is like, you asked for a car. Well, again, if I didn't communicate clearly what I wanted, that other person will never be able to understand or act in a way that we're looking for, right? Again, we need to communicate our message clearly so that we are aligned and thinking the same thing, understand the same message, the same thought, Otherwise, again, we won't be aligned. When we communicate a message through writing or through speaking or through any other means, this message passes through a filter, right? So remember I talked about like a cognitive bias. We have these glasses and these lenses on. This message, yeah, lemons or limes. I've gone through that myself. Some people I don't understand why I don't know the difference, understand the difference between a lemon and a lime. But what I was saying was, when we communicate that message to that other person, they have these glasses on, this cognitive bias, where they're interpreting your message through their filter, right? Again, what you say doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to that other person, or they understand it the way you understand it, right? Again, as human beings, we have our own thoughts. We've gone through different experiences. I mentioned the cognitive biases. These things filter that message that you're telling them and how they process it, right? Again, I'll use another example. If you ever played the game Telephone, right, where there's a line of people and the first person whispers another message to the next person until you reach that last person. I'll say 99.9% of the time that message has changed in some form or manner, right? It never is the same as what that first person told the group. So it's like telephone, but without all those people, and that person is one person telling the other person, and that message already changed, right? It's already changed because of all these individual thoughts, experiences, and these cognitive biases that everybody had. That message is like automatically changed. I'm sure. Okay, there are some things that are probably just can't be denied. There's fact like that. Hopefully they can't be challenged. Like water is wet. You know, humans need to breathe oxygen. These are like just pure facts, right? And I don't think a filter would interfere how that would change our understanding of those facts or those messages. But when we're talking about other things in general, again, it the message that your idea that you're trying to make gets distorted, right? I don't want to say it in a bad way. It's just that it doesn't end up meaning the same thing where based on its original intention of the person communicating the message, right? So again, I believe that clear communication is critical, is essential to ensure that people understand what that other person is trying to say. It's like you are responsible for getting your idea across, right? If you want that other person to understand, you have to ensure that they are understanding what you're saying or what you're telling them. And if that message is never clear, people will never be aligned. Right? We will never be able to understand what the other person is telling us if we truly do not understand their thoughts and our intentions. Right? It's one thing to tell the message to someone, but you have to ensure that they understand it. Right? Conversation is like a two-way street. Right? It's giving and receiving, and a conversation, communication is never going to work if there's not the communicator and the listener. So, okay, all I'm talking about is all these challenges and these problems. So, how can we fix this? So, my practical advice is when you try to communicate something to someone else or ask them to do something, you want to ensure that they understand by doing several things. So, number one, ask them if they understand and to repeat it back to you, right? So, I've done this in many meetings that when I've assigned a task, I always ask, could you please repeat back what I'm asking you to do or what you think you heard, right? So hopefully when they do that, they'll have to really think about what they just heard and communicate to you that they truly understand it, right? So this is where you're just doing a double check, right? Just ask them to repeat it back to you. Another way is to repeat your message, but in a different way. Right? There's so many methods to as to how you communicate your message to another person. Right? Again, physically, it could be through speaking or through writing, um, through an electronic medium. But also, you can use things such as like analogies, like I was talking about that car, right? Or use examples or situations where the other person is familiar with to give them context, right, as to what you're trying to ask or what you're trying to tell them, right? Um, I'm trying to think of an example, um, but hey, maybe I'll come back to it. As a leader, if you're asking someone to do something, like I'm not advocating micromanagement, but you may want to check in from time to time. Maybe when you assign the action item, part of the action is to provide an update after a specific amount of time has elapsed. Again, it depends on the level of trust you have with your team members. Once they've told you that they understand what you're talking about, a lot of times, if they're independent and they're capable, they can run on their own and you don't have to worry about it. But on the other hand, there's some people that you may be worried about, or even though they say they understand what you've told them, that it probably didn't really process in their minds. And this is where you need to do like come again a bit of a temperature check, right? And just touch base, make sure everything's going the wrong way, right way, because we want to go along the path. If they're deviating, you want to get them back on track and ensure that things are going as planned. I think with again today I'm talking about again in general it's basically about communication. But when we communicate with one another, it doesn't necessarily mean that the message you're conveying gets through or is understood, right? And what gets in the way? So I talked about two things, right? The cognitive bias, which is like a type of lens or filter that I would say everybody has that dictates how they process that message or how they understand that message. And the second thing was communication. That communication is a two-way street. You communicate or tell a message to someone else, and they have to listen. And not only listen, but they have to understand so that you ensure alignment. Yeah, right, David. I think that's more like a parent-child thing too. I remember telling that to my parents. Yeah, I totally understand. Just leave me alone. I would say recognize that we're all human and we're all different, right? That I believe that a big part of being human is being unique, right? And being unique means we don't think the same way, we don't do things the same way, we don't act the same way, right? And because of that, it probably gets in the way of how communication is given and interpreted. That yeah, just be aware that we are different and that we need to take that into consideration whenever we're trying to communicate our thoughts and our ideas to other people, right? That we may say one thing, but they interpret it differently, right? We want to communicate so clearly that the other person understands our thoughts and intentions and what we're trying to convey them without any misunderstanding, right? I think a large part of my career has been basically acting as I call it as like a translator or a bridge between people. There's always one group that wants something, and there's a group of problem solvers. And these people, they're trying to tell them what their problem is, but they never really are able to form the message or describe it in a way that the problem solvers can understand and solve their problem effectively, right? I think I've built a career just doing that, right? Being an interpreter or a messenger or a communicator, right? Um, I think as I was going through my career, I found it very surprising actually that people weren't able to communicate clearly with one another. I think I just took things for granted. I tend to be more detail oriented and more analytical in terms of the way I think. So usually in a work context anyways, that I would be very very detailed in what in the reports I wrote, and the emails I wrote, and the presentations I gave. But when it came to other people, I'm not saying I'm better than them, but it's just probably just a lack of awareness that whatever you try to tell another person doesn't always get understood, or the original intention is lost, right? Remember that telephone game, right? When that first person says that thing to the next person, and you go down the line, it's that very last person is going to get a totally different message from what was the original one, right? And it's my job to untangle that and interpret it, and reform that message and make it more clear so that that person understood, person receiving that message understood, right? Okay. So I think that was like the message I was trying to convey today, right? Um, Again, there's a cognitive bias that filters how we process messages. We need to communicate very clearly. Be aware that people are different. You need to take that into consideration whenever you're dealing with people in general, right? There's always a misunderstanding. One person believes they're right, and the other person disagrees. But possibly they probably believe in the same thing, but just from a different perspective, right? Again, you need to talk. You need to work together, and ensure that what you're telling each other is clear and understandable. All right, that's it for me today. A little bit shorter than usual. Um, that was what was on my mind. If you'd like to hear more from me, please stay tuned every Sunday, 11 o'clock. I'm always going to jump on Facebook Live, usually talk about something. If you have questions, please raise them to me. Also, hey, visit my website, www.coachhectorwong.com. There's a newsletter you can sign up to, and links to my other social media. Usually I'm very active on LinkedIn and Facebook. I also have a YouTube channel that I try to post at least once a week. So if any of this resonates with you, or you feel that people would find that of useful, hey, come give me a visit. Hey, you're welcome, Lara. I think from your experience as a speaker, right? Just because you tell someone something, again, doesn't mean they're able to understand it in the way that you wanted to communicate it, or your intention of, or the message you were trying to broadcast to them, right? All right, so I'm just probably killing time right now because I don't want to go outside and run because I need to exercise. But thank you everyone for listening. I'll see you soon next week or even sooner. All right, take care.